Hello everyone, welcome to another video with Rahul. This is the second part in the series How I Passed the Azure Fundamental AZ 900 exam, 25 must-know concept questions to pass the exam. In the first video, we discussed about the exam and general tips. Then we discussed about 14 services that you must know to pass the exam. And this one, we are going to cover rest of the key concepts, and you should expect a lot of questions on what I discussed in this video. So please don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the video. Okay. So in the last video, we discussed till Azure Monitor Services. In this video, we're going to discuss what is the key difference between Azure Service Health and Azure Monitor Service. So what you need to remember is we use Azure Service Health to track if there is any service disruption for any service across the regions from Azure side. And Azure Monitor Service is used to track any issues on the Azure services that you are using. So that's the key difference, and it will test you on this. Now, from the Azure security point of view, there are about four services that you need to know. The first one is the Azure Security Center. So it's basically a central dashboard for all the security features. It gives you a score on the policy and resource security hygiene. So for all the services that you're using, it will give you some score on where you are. It comes in two tiers, the free, which has Azure Defender off, and then the paid one, which has Azure Defender on. So in an exam, it's going to ask you which security Azure service are you going to use for a central dashboard, which gives you scores, gives you view on your security hygiene. So that's going to be Azure Security Center. Now, where do you store your database passwords, your certificates, keys? So that you do in a Azure keyboard. So you need to remember this. Then you could have a question around what is a service that you use for centralizing all log files and doing automated threat detection. So if you read automated threat detection, there's a good possibility that you need to use Azure Sentinel. Then Azure dedicated host, if due to some reasons you require a physical machine dedicated to your account or customer, then you can use Azure dedicated host. So you can run multiple virtual machines on this physical service that is dedicated to you, and that could be due to licensing agreement or any privacy security reasons. The next one is the Azure privacy and compliance. So this is super critical. Expect at least 3 questions from this. So first thing you need to know is if you need in-depth information around security, privacy, and compliance offerings across Microsoft and Azure cloud products, you need to go to Trust Center. So you need to remember this is the place you need to go to get all this information. Then online service terms, it gives you all the details of terms of agreement between Azure and customer, SLAs, and other such general information. So this is where you get these details. Now, data protection privacy is super important. So you need to know that you can build applications that are compliant with GDPR rules for EU region. So it's compliant. Then finally, you have the Azure sovereign region. So if you see, you can launch your resources in any region on the Azure portal except China and US government. Sorry, this is not Azure, but this is US government. So this has certain restrictions, and not everybody can launch services in these two regions. So you need to know what is Azure sovereign region, and there could be a question on this. Now on the Azure governance, you need to know what's the difference between RBAC and IAM. So mainly RBAC. So RBAC is a role-based access control. So you can have 3 levels. You can have the reader who has reader-only access, contributor who can edit and read, and then finally owner. And the difference between these two is that owner has an additional privilege of granting access to others. Then what is IAM? Is the page that typically used to assign roles to grant access to Azure resources. So you need to know the difference between the two. Then logs is another important concept. You can expect one question at least. So raw resources, the resource log is basically used for preventing accidental delete. So it can be in 2 forms. Cannot delete. So you can modify, you can read, but if you apply cannot delete, then you cannot delete the resource. The other one is read only. So you cannot even modify, you can just only read what is there in the service, but you cannot modify or delete. It can be applied at two level, at the resource level as well as resource group level. This is like more like an application level if you have multiple resources within the resource group. Then the third thing you need to on governance is resource tag. This is other super important. It's going to be a question on this. Basically, it adds metadata to resources. So it will give you, if you can add any kind of a tag. So you can tag it to which business unit. Say you are a banking application. So you have credit card unit, you have mortgage, you have retail banking. So you can apply tags, and what that does is it gives you details. Okay, which application this resource belongs to, which business unit it belongs to, which team it belongs to. And the most importantly, it helps in billing transparency. So you want to know, okay, how much cost is being incurred by credit card business unit or by retail business unit. So it gives you billing transparency. So you need to remember this. Now you need to know the difference between Azure Blueprint versus Azure Policy versus Azure Advisory. So Azure Blueprint is more like architectural pattern standards. It's more like a cross account kind of templates that you implement. So there are predefined templates for US government, for HIPAA compliance. You can also create your own templates, but they are more across accounts and not resource focused. So Azure Policy, that is more focused on, so these are JSON policies for resources. They are more resource focused. Azure Blueprint is more cross account at an account level architecture patterns and some standards. But Azure Policy is more focused on at a resource level. So you can access or deny access to resources based on the Azure Policy. So policy versus initiative, when you group together policy, it's called an initiative. Now you need to know what is cloud adoption framework. It's basically strategy document or a framework that provides you guidance on how to migrate from on-prem to Azure. So what are the kind of things you need to think through from a strategy perspective? So it helps you plan, be ready, adopt, govern, and manage. It's more like a strategy document on migration. You need to know a few things on Azure costs. So you need to remember inbound data is always free on Azure. Any incoming data to any service will be free. So outbound, if it's going outbound, then it will vary based on the service and the region. So you need to remember there are three categories at a broad level. So there's a free tier in Azure. Then there's pay per usage, event driven like Azure Functions. If you use it 3 times in a day for 3 minutes, then you're just going to be charged for those 3 times that service has been invoked. If it doesn't get invoked in the whole day, you will not be charged. Then you have pay per time like a virtual machine. So whether you use it or not, you will be charged for that. So then you also have reserved instances. Is important. If you reserve the instance for 1 year, 3 years, then you're going to get some cost benefits. Then you have Azure pricing calculator to help you assess what is the cost that is there for running that particular Azure service. So then you have the Azure advisory for cost. I think we already discussed in the first video. This is important. You should know that. So Azure connectivity, this is another very important topic. The first thing is virtual networks. You need to know what virtual networks are. They are basically fundamental building blocks for private networks in Azure. So it's a logical separation. So when you create a VNet, that means you are creating a logical data center. So VNet pairing, say you have two regions, one in US and one in India. So what you will do is, if you need to connect those two virtual networks that you built, Azure India region and Azure US region, you can create VNet pairing so that the services in those two regions can talk to each other. So it can be cross region or it can be same region. Or you can also have two VNets in the same region, and unless you do VNet pairing, then they will not be able to talk to each other. So express route is when you are in a hybrid cloud computing environment where you have resources on-premise and on-premise data center, and you have on the Azure as well. So you have two ways. You can either use a VPN, but that traverses over the public internet. That's going to be slow. So you can use an express route that creates the private connection between your on-premise data center and Azure. That will be a high-speed connection. So you need to remember that. Then you can use VPN gateway, as I said, for your on-premise to Azure connectivity, but that traverses, as I said, over the public internet. That's going to be slow, slightly slow. You can also use a VPN gateway for cross-region Azure VNet connectivity, so something similar to VNet pairing. One thing you need to know and you need to remember is what are the components that you will install both on the customer side and Azure side, both for VNet for sorry the VPN gateway. So you need to know that what are the components that so you will be tested. Okay, so quickly on the Azure Compute. So virtual machine, Azure virtual is just basically a virtual machine that you can use. Then app service, it's more like a managed web app. Then you have the Azure Container Service. Container Service, it's the container service from Azure itself. It's a managed service again. Then you have Azure Kubernetes. So this is based on the Kubernetes service, open source, but it will be in a managed. It will be managed by Azure. And then you have the Windows Virtual Desktop. So desktop on the cloud where infrastructure is managed by the Azure, and you can just so on the storage side, you have 5 services. You have the container blob. Basically, it's an object storage. You need to remember it's an object storage, and it has 3 tiers. It can be used for any storing any kind of data, semi-structured, unstructured, videos, audios. Basically, you can create a data lake out of it. You can store any kind of data. So you need to remember that. So Azure files, they are more like file storage, something very similar to what you store on the laptop. Uh, Basically, you store your files. So it uses the SMB protocol, file storage. Then you need to know Azure queue. Basically, it's a messaging service. If you have distributed system, so you have an say microservice based architecture, and there's one, what we call as publisher subscriber model. So there is one service that continuously publishes, but consumer cannot consume those data feed at the same pace. So you have some kind of messaging service in between Azure queue. It publishers to queue at their own rate, and then the consumers, there could be multiple consumers who consume at their own rate. Then you have Azure tables. Azure tables is basically a NoSQL database, something very similar to Cosmos DB, but this is regional, that is global. So Azure disk is basically the storage that you use for the virtual machines. So it's a block level storage. Then you have the serverless functions. You have the Azure function. It's basically, you need to remember that's an event-driven serverless compute service. So it will not run by itself. Only when there is an event, say you upload a file to a container blob, then and you need to then perform some actions on it. So it will trigger the Azure function, which will perform some compute action and then do a downstream action. So it will not run by itself. It needs a trigger to uh, execute any compute service. So then you have Azure Logic Ops. It's more like a workflow service, workflow orchestrator. So if you need to perform 5 actions through the 5 different Azure resources, it can be used to orchestrate those 5 actions. And then you have the event grid. It basically you build an application. It's like an intermediary. It gets some event from the source, and then it triggers a downstream Azure service. So that's what an event grid is. Then you need to know about Azure DevOps solution. So Azure DevOps basically is an end-to-end pipeline with boards, repos, pipeline, etc. So that's what Azure DevOps does. Then you have the GitHub, which is basically a code repo which Microsoft had taken over. Then you have the Azure Dev Test Labs. So it's basically a sandbox environment for testing. Then you have the Azure DB. So you have about 4. So you're in Cosmos DB. We already discussed Azure Table. So it's very similar. It's a NoSQL database, but it's globally distributed compared to the Azure Tables. Now Azure SQL DB, it's database as a service. Basically, it's a managed service from Azure. Then you have Azure DB for MySQL and Postgres. Again, it's a managed service. Everything is managed by on the underlying OS, etc., patching, monitoring by Azure. Then you have the SQL manager. So it's a full-fledged SQL server. So scenario, how you will be tested? Okay, which is the database best for storing JSON object or unstructured data? So you need to choose. Then on the Azure Big Data side, what you need to know is Azure Synapse Analysis is basically a kind of a data warehouse. Then you have Azure HD Insights. It uses all open source big data technologies, Hadoop, HBase, Spark. And then you have the Azure database. It's similar to HD Insight, but it's just based on the Spark. And then finally, you have the Azure Identity Services. You have the Azure Microsoft. So there's a lot of focus on this. So you need to deep dive into a little bit more into this. Then you have the multi-factor authentication. You need to know what that is. And then you have the Premium 1 license and Premium 2 license. So you need to know the difference between the features that are provided from Premium 1 and Premium 2. Okay, that's pretty much it. Please like and subscribe if you like the video. Thank you very much.